Welcome at the French Institute for this new event of the Beyond Words Festival. All our events are accessible either online, live and replayed, or here on site at the French Institute. Today, for this conversation entitled The Wretched of History, we're delighted to host Éric Vuillard online from Tours, Douglas Stewart online from New York, and Boyd Tonkin here on site in London. Éric Vuillard is a writer and filmmaker born in Lyon in 1968. He has written 9 award-winning books, including La Bataille d'Occident and Congo, both of which received the 2012 Prix Francesel and the 2013 Prix Valéry Larbaud. He won the 2017 Prix Goncourt, France's most prestigious literary prize, for L'Ordre du Jour. In 2019, its English translation, The Order of the Day, was chosen as Waterstone Book of the Month, and Éric Vuillard also received that year's Hay Medal for Fiction. His latest publication is The War of the Poor, translated by Marc Polizotti and published by Picador. The War of the Poor was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize 2021. So let's keep fingers crossed until the 2nd of June. Douglas Stewart is a Scottish-American author. His extraordinary debut novel, Shuggie Bain, won the Booker Prize last year. It is published by Picador in the UK and by Globe Edition in France, and is to be translated into 34 languages. Douglas' short stories, Found Wanting and The Englishman, were published in The New Yorker. His essay, Poverty, Anxiety and Gender in Scottish Working Class Literature, was published by LitHub. Born in Glasgow, he has an MA from the Royal College of Art in London, and since 2000 he has lived and worked in New York City. Boyd Tonkin is a writer, editor and critic who in 2020 was awarded the Royal Society of Literature's annual Benson Medal for outstanding service to literature. His writing on literature and arts currently appears in international media, including The Economist, The Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal, New York Review of Books, The Times Literary Supplement, and The Spectator. As literary editor and then senior writer of The Independent, he refounded the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize and judged it from 2001 until 2015. He chaired the Mang Booker Prize International 2016 and then became the prize's special advisor. His Reader's Guide to Global Fiction, The 100 Best Novels in Translation, appeared in 2018. Let me welcome also David Mildon, who is here with us in the Salon of the French Institute, and who will read some passages from both The War of the Poor and Shuggie Bain. And Axel Oxborough, our interpreter, will translate Eric's word into English. And now, over to you, Boyd.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and welcome everybody to this hybrid occasion in which a return of real literary events really coexists with the online format we've got used to, for better or worse, over the last 15 months or so. But this evening, it's especially exciting to be able to welcome Éric and Douglas, two of the writers who have received the most prestigious honors that their respective literatures have to offer, the Prix Goncourt and the Booker Prize. But it's also ironic that we're here to talk not about triumph and success and awards, but, if you like, their opposite, the struggle of those forgotten or overlooked by history, and to ask how their voices, their interests, can best be represented in literature. The War of the Poor and Shuggie Bain are two extraordinary, very different, but oddly complementary answers to that question. What we're going to do is to have a two-part discussion separated by our first reading by David from The War of the Poor, then another segment of discussion followed by extracts from Shuggie Bain, and then some questions from the audience here. And it's really heartening to be able to welcome a proper live audience again. So I'm going to begin with Eric, with The War of the Poor, and with this novel, if you want to call it a novel, that in a very brief compass takes us back to the violent convulsions of Central Europe in the 1520s, when the Reformation triggered a peasant uprising that wanted to go far beyond the limited church reforms proposed by Martin Luther and his associates, and to create a real social revolution. An uprising led by various people, but above all by the figure who stands at the center of the War of the Poor, Thomas Müntzer, a radical preacher, a firebrand, a wandering prophet, and someone whose voice and whose vision dominates the novel. So I'd like to start by asking Eric why the figure of Thomas Müntzer held such an attraction for him, and why in the 21st century it's necessary to remember him.
Pourquoi est-ce que Thomas Müntzer tient un tel attrait pour vous, et pourquoi au XXIe siècle il est important de se souvenir de lui?
So, good evening, everybody, and thank you for the Beyond Words Festival for the invitation. Thank you to the French Institute. Thank you, Boyd Tonkin, who make us the honor to organize the dialogue. Thank you, Douglas Stuart, who accepted to dialogue with me tonight. Thank you to the interpreter Axel Oxborough. I meet you for the second time. Now I will speak in French. Alors, tout d'abord, on peut dire que nous vivons un moment où les inégalités s'accroissent. Ça n'est un secret pour personne. Elles s'accroissent même de façon vertigineuse. Je crois me souvenir que le trésor, enfin ce dont dispose, les liquidités en quelque sorte, dont dispose une société comme Microsoft par exemple, ou une des grandes sociétés de l'informatique, peuvent être de l'ordre de 200, 300 milliards de dollars. Donc vous voyez, c'est à peu près le PIB de certains États européens, c'est même supérieur au PIB du Portugal. Or, il se trouve que cette somme pour le Portugal est produite par la totalité des personnes actives au Portugal qui travaillent. Ça signifie donc qu'on est à un moment au fond, où, alors que pour Microsoft, ça n'est qu'une trésorerie, vous voyez, quelque chose dont elle peut, avec lequel elle peut agir directement. Donc on voit que là, il y a une forme de disproportion qui est à tout le moins inquiétante. Alors évidemment, le contexte est très différent, mais ce qui m'a retenu, intéressé tout particulièrement chez Müntzer au départ, c'est son écriture. C'est que Müntzer est bien sûr, comme vous l'avez rappelé, un théologien, c'est aussi un homme d'action, un chef de guerre même, puisque pendant cette guerre civile, Müntzer va diriger au fond les troupes de paysans, mais c'est également un écrivain.
I just wanted to talk about him because in our world we can see inequalities rising at a vertiginous pace. For instance, the liquidity of Microsoft, its general income is $200-300 billion, which is the equivalent of the GDP of Portugal. Except in Portugal, it takes a whole country to reach that. For Microsoft, it is mere liquidity, and that's worrying. In this very different context, of course, I wanted to evoke Thomas Munster, who held a specific attraction to me because of his writing. He's obviously a theologian. He is also a war leader, but he's also a writer.
Et donc, à travers sa prose, en m'approchant de lui, en lisant ses sermons, ses correspondances, il m'a semblé trouver une nouvelle manière, finalement, au moment donc de la Réforme, de formuler le rapport inégalitaire. Une façon très vive et qui passe par la prose, c'est-à-dire une forme de savoir particulier passait par à travers l'écriture de Thomas Munster.
And through his sermons, through his letters, I saw a new way of talking about these inequalities through the strength of portrayed in his writings.
Je sais d'ailleurs que Boyd Tonkin est très sensible aux questions particulièrement sensible aux questions de la traduction, et c'est lié à ça d'une certaine manière, puisque au fond, l'écriture de Munster, c'est une écriture en langue vulgaire, en allemand. Et c'est l'un des enjeux principaux de la Réforme, sortir du latin, sortir du privilège, sortir d'une langue élitaire qui ne concerne que quelques-uns. Et c'est ça l'invention de la prose.
And I know that Boyd is quite sensitive to translation, and in fact this is connected because his writings are in vulgar German, and that's the whole idea of the Reform, just of the Reformation, getting out of Latin and using vulgar language.
C'est un peu plus compliqué. Il y a, à rajouter que donc c'est sortir de la langue vulgaire et que c'est ça l'invention de la prose. C'est-à-dire que c'est là que commence cette aventure de la littérature qui est la naissance de la prose.
And that is when prose and writing, real writing, was born, and that's probably the basis of literature.
Could I go on to ask how far you were affected in your portrayal of the uprisings of the 1520s in Germany by more recent rebellions of the downtrodden or the poor in Europe and elsewhere? How far are you looking at the Peasants' War in Germany through the lens of our own experience of revolt?
Jusqu'à quel point avez-vous été affecté par la connexion entre la révolte paysanne en Allemagne, dont vous parlez dans le livre, et des révolutions plus récentes qui pourraient avoir marqué votre vision? Et donc, à travers ce prisme, avez-vous été affecté par des révoltes plus contemporaines?
Alors, tout d'abord, en fait, on voit toujours l'histoire depuis le présent. C'est au fond le présent qui détermine avant tout, effectivement, vous avez raison, notre lecture du passé. C'est comme si une vérité, à chaque fois, qui est la même en partie et différente, nous revenait depuis le passé.
Yes, of course. History is often seen through the eyes of the present. The present informs our reading of past events.
Ça n'est d'ailleurs pas sans rapport avec le problème de la traduction que j'évoquais. C'est-à-dire qu'évidemment, il existe des faits. Et ça, c'est ce qu'on appelle la fidélité au texte dans la traduction, donc la fidélité aux événements du passé. Et dans le même temps, il existe toujours avec la traduction de l'interprétation. Eh bien, l'histoire est une tension entre la fidélité et l'interprétation.
So, of course, there are facts, and facts are all about being faithful to the events that occurred. But then there is translation. Translation is interpretation. And we are seeing here this tension between the facts and the interpretation.
Alors, ce qui, du coup, depuis aujourd'hui, m'a frappé dans la révolte, dans ce soulèvement paysan de 1524, c'est son aspect hétérogène. C'est-à-dire que ça n'est pas un mouvement uniquement paysan, comme il a été trop souvent décrit par les historiens. C'est un mouvement de paysans, de petits ouvriers, c'est un mouvement d'étudiants, c'est un mouvement aussi où on trouve donc des mineurs, des artisans des villes, des petits commerçants. Et cette hétérogénéité-là est le fait, je crois, des révoltes contemporaines, où on trouve des gens très différents, puisqu'on est sorti de l'aspect, disons, monolithique du prolétariat. C'est une autre figure qui se lève.
And what struck me in the Peasant Revolts is actually how heterogeneous it was. It was a movement that was not just for the peasants. It also involved laborers, students, miners, shopkeepers, and that just had a connection with the contemporary nature of revolts.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'm going to bring in Douglas at this point, and then after our first reading, we can go back to questions that both of you might be able to answer. And Douglas, what I wanted to ask, first of all, was the question of whether you thought of Shuggie Bain in the long process when you were working on it as, if you like, a kind of historical novel in the way that The War of the Poor is obviously a historical piece. How far did you think you were recreating a Glasgow that had gone, or did you still think that the city of your memories, the city of your imagination was still very much there?
That's a good question. Thank you for having me tonight, Boyd, and thank you to Eric. You know, I had very humble goals when I was writing Shuggie Bain. I set out with the intention of only writing a love story both between a mother and a son, and also with the family and the city that they are in. Part of the reason for writing the book, I think, was to write into the silence. Shuggie and his mother are figures that we don't often see in literature in the west coast of Scotland or in Britain when we look at socioeconomic things or when we look at industrial upheaval. And so I had always felt very erased by that, being a young queer man from Britain, that you never saw me or my like in literature in that time. And so I was writing in a way into the silence of that. And the silence extends because I thought I was writing a book that was historical, and I thought I was writing about a world that no longer exists. But I also understood that people didn't even acknowledge that it was there. We didn't like to talk about it, and we didn't like to think that we'd even come through that. And it was an extraordinary moment in history. You know, it was 26% unemployment in Glasgow. It had such shockwaves through every corner of the society that I grew up in. What did it mean to be a man? What did it mean to be a wife? You know, how were young men going to come into the world? And yet I published this book and we think it's historical fiction. And then the very first thing it does is it slams into a political moment in the United Kingdom where we're still you know, treading on young poor people, especially young poor men. We're not giving school dinners to kids. There's too many kids living in poverty. There's too much addiction in Scotland still. There are all of these things. And so in a lot of ways, it's not a historical novel at all.
And you were writing it in New York. How far did that distance help you? How far did it possibly make things more difficult?
I actually found it only helped me. It did, I hope, a lot of things for me. First of all, it created a sense of longing inside myself. Part of the motivation for writing the book was a feeling of homesickness, both for the place, both for my hometown of Glasgow, but as I said, for a time that might no longer exist. But at the heart of the book is the loss of a mother and the grief that her children feel about that. And that was inspired very much about the loss of my own mother, who succumbed to her addiction when I was in high school. And so the distance for me gave me that sense of longing. It gave me that sense of wanting to create this world and commit to a project over 10 years. But it also gave me a sense of clarity, I think. It allowed me to see the time and the moment in Glasgow and to think about the parts I really wanted to talk about. It also gave me a little bit of bravery because I think being on the outside and reflecting back on it is perhaps an easier thing to do than being in the middle of it and feeling like you owe something to the people around you or the community around you. And so there was a little bit of bravery there too, but it mostly came from a sense of longing. That's what the distance did.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to ask about going back to our subject this evening of the wretched of history. Now, literature that tries to give people who've been oppressed a voice often insists on their dignity, their nobility, their capacity to attract admiration. And of course, Agnes has all of that, but she doesn't only have that. She has tremendous fragility, vulnerability. So how did you set about rescuing those who have been harmed by history, harmed by their circumstances, while allowing that part of that, the result of that harm is enduring damage, enduring fragility?
I think part of the reason why the book took me 10 years to write is because I had to undergo an education in empathy myself. When I was writing about a lot of traumas from my own childhood or from the community I grew up in, it's very easy to write about what they look like and what they feel like, but I had to project myself into the mind of the people that were sometimes perpetrating them, why they behaved that way, what were the causes that brought good people to doing questionable things sometimes. And so I had to really reflect on my own mother's experience, perhaps, and thinking about why would a woman want to give up all hope and the love of her 3 children and sink into the mire of addiction. But I had found that one of the things that was most useful for me in telling the story, I wanted to do one thing and then I used a tool in another way. And the one thing I wanted to do at first was to make Agnes as complex as a character as possible. And that didn't mean she was tricky or difficult. It just means she has lots of prisms and facets to her nature. I wanted to show her as a mother, as a wife, as a friend, as someone who's looking for love, as a foe, as an enemy to the women across the road. I wanted to show her as lots of different women before she even begins to descend into her addiction. And that was in answering something that we do in society. You know, when someone becomes addicted to something, especially when it's a woman, we relegate them or we push them to the side very quickly. We put labels on them and then we don't want to look. And having suffered through that with my own mother, I knew there was a person there that was as generous and gregarious and complicated and as hurt as anybody can be. And yet people didn't want to see it. She was just that one thing and therefore she was no good. And so I resisted that throughout the book. And even if it was a very simple scene, I just wanted to celebrate all of the sadness and the joy that the character had. And so that was really what I wanted to do and how I tried to set out with Agnes. But there's a lot of pressure on working class voices, on what the working class wants us to talk about and then what the middle class is ready to receive. And sometimes when you talk about hard times from the working class, it's seen as a safari through poverty or it's seen as sensationalism. But the truth is I'm central to my own life. And so when I write about these things, I reject other people's lenses on it because I don't feel any way about it. I don't have a middle class lens that I press on it. This is just the center of my universe. And it needs the dignity of details. It needs us to be immersive. It needs us to spend time in it because this is life.
I love that idea of the dignity of details. And of course, the book is wonderfully packed with all of that. It's also packed with a very particular kind of humor, the Glaswegian humor, that I won't say it softens the edges of suffering, but it makes them technicolor, if you like. And of course, some people say that ability to laugh, to make comedy out of your ordeals, kind of softens, so it dampens the anger, it dampens the urge to change. Do you feel that, or is humor an essential part of being able to work for change?
Yes, I think humor is essential to the Glaswegian spirit. I think there's the saying that you would rather go to a Glaswegian funeral than an Edinburgh wedding because you'll have more fun at a Glaswegian funeral. And I think that's true. I think we are a people who face life because often we don't have the comfort of money and we try and deflect a lot of things through humor, or we try to release it as a valve in a way. You know, we are, or I was, the son of a man and a community that sent men into the face of the earth. And, every single day their lives were in jeopardy. And we didn't ask them, we didn't allow them to express themselves, to say, I am scared, or I am fearful, or I don't want to do that, or I have dreams bigger than that. We just expected them to build ships and to get coal and to do all these things and to come out and be okay. We didn't give them any mental health assistance. We didn't ask them about their tenderer feelings. And so therefore, humor is a really important coping mechanism. It's a really important way of taking very dark things and just getting through it. And that is, I think, sometimes the meaning of life. You just have to keep going. And that's certainly what Shuggie and Agnes do. But also, Glasgow is fascinating for me. I've been around the world and I've never met people like Glaswegians. And what I love oftentimes is how very contrasting things can exist within the Glaswegian experience at the same time. We can have real tenderness and violence and tenderness, sadness with humor, and there can be just darkness with light all the time. And I like that sort of uneven keel of it, and that you're always on the wrong foot sometimes. And I wanted the reader, when they went into any chapter, even if it was a very happy chapter, to be waiting for the other shoe to drop, or to be waiting for the turn in the narrative. Because I think sometimes that's what Glasgow felt like to me.
Thank you so much. Well, I think possibly it's time for us to hear our first extract, which will be from The War of the Poor. And David, over to you.
Histoire de Thomas Munzer. Son père avait été pendu. Il était tombé dans le vide comme un sac de grains. On avait dû le porter la nuit sur l'épaule, puis il était resté silencieux, la bouche pleine de terre. Alors, tout avait pris feu. Les chênes, les prés, les rivières, le gaillet des talus, la terre pauvre, l'église, tout. Il avait 11 ans. Dès l'âge de 15 ans, il avait fondé une ligue secrète contre l'archevêque de Magdebourg et l'église de Rome. Il lisait les épîtres de Clément, le martyre de Polycarpe, les fragments de Papias. Avec quelques camarades, il chantait les merveilles de Dieu, traversait le Jourdain en robe de chambre et, traçant à la craie sur le sol la roue cosmique, signe de rassemblement, ils s'allongeaient dedans, chacun leur tour, et se mettaient les bras en croix, afin que descende le ciel dans la terre. Et puis, lui se souvenait du cadavre de son père, de sa langue énorme comme une parole unique qui aura séché. J'étais dans la joie, mais on ne s'unit à Dieu que par des terribles douleurs et le désespoir. C'est ce qu'il croyait. On raconte qu'à Stolberg, un certain Barthol Munzer aurait été vigneron. On parle encore d'un Monkser Berd et d'un Monkser Mert, mais on n'en sait rien. Il y a aussi Thomas Minzer, mort dans une bagarre de tripot. On ne sait pas s'il avait pris une mornifle ou le coin d'une bûche sur la gueule. On ne sait pas non plus s'il fut ou non parent de l'autre Thomas Munzer, celui dont le père, vers 1500, pour des raisons inconnues, fut exécuté sur les ordres du comte de Stolberg. Certains disent pendu, d'autres brûlés. 50 ans plus tôt, une pâte brûlante avait coulé. Elle avait coulé depuis Mayence sur tout le reste de l'Europe. Elle avait coulé entre les collines de chaque ville, entre les lettres de chaque nom, dans les gouttières, par les méandres de chaque pensée, et chaque lettre, chaque morceau d'idée, chaque signe de ponctuation s'était retrouvé pris dans un bout de métal. On les avait repartis dans un tiroir de bois. Les mains en avaient choisi un et encore un, et on avait composé des mots, des lignes, des pages, et on les avait mouillés d'encre, et une force prodigieuse avait appuyé lentement les lettres sur le papier. On avait refait ça des dizaines et des dizaines de fois, avant de plier les feuilles en 4, en 8, en 16. Elles avaient été mises les unes à la suite des autres, collées ensemble, cousues, enveloppées dans du cuir. Ça avait fait un livre, la Bible. Ainsi, en 3 ans, on en fit 180, pendant qu'un seul moine, lui, n'en aurait copié qu'une. Et les livres s'étaient multipliés comme les vers dans le corps. Or, le petit Thomas Munzer lisait la Bible. Il grandit avec Ézéchiel, Osée, Daniel, mais c'était l'Ézéchiel de Gutenberg, l'Osée de Gutenberg et son Daniel. Et après avoir franchi le branlant pourri qui bâillait et raclait par terre, il restait de longs moments en bas, dans la vieille cuisine, à se frotter les yeux. Il ne savait pas ce qu'il voyait ni ce qu'il devait voir. Il était seul comme un voleur et innocent. Le temps passa. Il vécut avec sa mère, sans doute chichement. Son cœur le faisait souffrir. Sous les chênes, les sapins, sur la terre pauvre du Harz, tandis qu'avec d'autres enfants, il courait après les cochons, il devait s'arrêter seul, soudain stupide, et pleurer. Oui, je l'imagine au bord d'une rivière de petits cailloux noirs. La vipère, ou le krebsbach, peu importe. Ou bien sur les flancs des petits sommets tristes de chaos rocheux, collines érodées, tourbières miteuses dans la vallée de la Baude ou de l'Ocker, étouffant dans un mélange d'amertume et d'amour. The story of Thomas Müntzer. His father had been hanged, dropped into the void like a sack of feed. They'd had to carry him on their shoulders at night. Then he made not a sound, his mouth full of earth. After that, everything had caught fire. The oaks, the fields, the rivers, the white bedstraw on the embankment, the barren soil, the church, everything. He was 11 years old. At the age of 15, he had formed a secret league to oppose the Archbishop of Magdeburg and the Church of Rome. He read the epistles of Clement, the martyrdom of Polycarp, Papias' fragments. With several comrades, he praised God's marvels, crossed the Jordan in a dressing gown. Afterwards, he traced the cosmic wheel, a sign of assembly, on the ground in chalk, and they each lay on it in turn, arms outstretched, so that heaven might descend to earth. And then he remembered the corpse of his father, the enormous tongue like a single desiccated word. I was filled with joy, but one unites with God only through terrible suffering and despair. That's what he believed. They say that in Stolborg there was a vintner by the name of Bartol Munzer, and they still talk about a Monkser Beld and a Monksers Bert, but nothing is known about them. There is also a Thomas Minzer killed in a bar brawl. We don't know if he got hit in the face with a fist or a log, nor do we know if he was related to Thomas Munzer, the one whose father, around 1500, for reasons unknown, was executed on the orders of the Count of Stolberg. Some say hanged, others say burned. 50 years earlier, a molten substance had flowed from mines over the rest of Europe, flowed between the hills of every town, between the letters of every name, in the gutters, between every twist and turn of thought, and every letter, every fragment of an idea, every punctuation mark had found itself cast in a bit of metal. They had arranged them in wooden trays. Hands had plucked out one, then another, composed words, lines, pages. They had moistened them with ink, and a great force had slowly pressed the letters onto paper. They had repeated this procedure dozens and dozens of times before folding the sheets into signatures of 4 or 8 or 16 pages. They had put them in sequence, glued them together, sewn them, bound them in leather. They had made a book, the Bible. And so, in the space of 3 years, they had made 180 copies, where in that time a single monk would have made only one. And then the books had multiplied like maggots in a corpse. Now young Thomas Müntzer read the Bible, grew up with Ezekiel, Hosea, Daniel, but they were Gutenberg's Ezekiel, Gutenberg's Hosea, Gutenberg's Daniel. And after passing through the rotten, yawning gate that scraped the ground, he spent long hours downstairs in the old kitchen rubbing his eyes. He didn't know what he was seeing or what he was supposed to see. He was solitary like a thief and innocent. Time passed. He lived with his mother, no doubt frugally. His heart hurt. Beneath the oaks, the pines, on the poor soil of the Harz Mountains, as he chased after pigs with other children, he must have suddenly stopped short, alone, feeling foolish, and wept. Yes. I imagine him on the edge of a river of small black pebbles, the Wipper, perhaps, or the Krebsbach, no matter. Or else on the flanks of a sad little summit of chaotic rock, eroded cliffs, shabby peat bogs in the Bode or Oker Valley, suffocating in a mix of bitterness and love.
Thank you so much, David, for that wonderful reading, which reminded me that one thing that these books absolutely have in common is the ability to evoke childhood, and the way that, in a sense, all children are outsiders, whatever subsequently becomes of them. And could I ask Eric, first of all, whether you were aware of that sense of the child in Thomas Müntzer, to some extent determining the adult revolutionary that he became?
Pensez-vous avoir été conscient du sens de l'enfance de Thomas Müntzer qui aurait déterminé l'adulte révolutionnaire qu'il deviendrait?
Alors, tout d'abord, ce qui me frappe, c'est que, on sait très bien, enfin, c'est le thème même d'une certaine façon de cette discussion, les misérables en quelque sorte échappent à l'histoire, échappent aux archives, mais les enfants peut-être encore davantage que les autres.
Of course, it's the theme that misery escapes history, and children among the more miserable, most of all.
Ça n'est sans doute d'ailleurs pas pour rien si la littérature à la fois et le cinéma, au moment, certainement pour le cinéma même de sa naissance, se tourne vers le récit de l'enfance. C'est le début de l'œuvre de Chaplin, d'une certaine façon, en tout cas de ses longs métrages, c'est le kid.
And literature and cinema, even at its beginnings, turned to childhood, as exemplified by Chaplin and the kid.
On peut dire d'ailleurs que ça caractérise tout entier l'œuvre de Dickens.
And that, of course, is the whole work of Charles Dickens.
Et donc, pour ce qui concerne Müntzer, évidemment, son enfance, telle que je l'interprète, sort évidemment du silence.
And of course, Thomas Muntzer's childhood, as I interpreted it, stems out from this silence, comes out.
Et donc, elle est construite à partir d'une certaine manière, des déterminations sociales qui sont les siennes. Et c'est d'ailleurs au fond comme cela que la littérature travaille toujours.
And stemming from that social determination is, in fact, the way literature functions.
Puisque autrement, l'enfance, je le disais, resterait dans le silence. Pour faire une comparaison, vous voyez, les romans de Jane Austen, d'une certaine façon, ont fait sortir la femme de la petite gentry anglaise du silence où l'histoire l'avait ravalée et où la littérature jusqu'ici la tenait.
Otherwise, the children would stay in silence, and that's exemplified in Jane Austen, for instance, who extracted women from the place which they had in society and literature up to there.
Et cependant, dans ces livres, tandis qu'un certain type de femme devient visible, il n'y a pas les domestiques.
And as women become more visible, there are no servants.
C'est-à-dire que les personnages de Jane Austen sont servis par des domestiques qu'on ne voit jamais dans ces livres, qu'on n'entend jamais parler, qui n'ont ni dialogue. Ce sont ce qu'on appelle des figurants.
And the servants in Jane Austen's books have no lines to say, nothing. They're merely extras in the story.
Et donc, tout comme Jane Austen a fait sortir les femmes de la gentry anglaise du silence, le rôle de la littérature est aussi de faire sortir les enfants de l'ombre où les archives les tiennent.
And just as Jane Austen allowed women to come out of this silence, literature allows children to come out of silence as well.
Could I maybe bring in Douglas here? Because Shuggie is, of course, a very particular child in a particular place. But if we're talking about the Wretched of history, is there the child's perception of injustice, unfairness? Is that a kind of, if you like, a universal currency that you can find whenever writers try to put injustice at the center of their work, that somewhere there has to be a child's eye saying, this is not right, this is not fair?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I tried to use Shuggie as a very clear lens in the book when we look at misogyny or addiction or homophobia or poverty, just tough times. But I also wanted to use children as, or use Shuggie specifically in almost quite a heroic way, where he has the innocence of a child and he has the comfort of not having other context or other things to draw upon. And so where people around his mother, who is crumbling under her addiction, start to peel away from Agnes, Shuggie is able to return to the situation again and again with just love. And so he isn't almost aware of the injustice of it. He's just aware that the person he loves the most in the world is suffering poorly. And I thought that was one of the most remarkable things about some children is they have this capacity to be tested constantly and they can return with love. And it's only really when we become adults or when we start to understand a broader world. And actually that's sometimes the function of poverty, is we don't have that mobility. You don't know anything more than the 4 streets that you're on. And by the way, when the 4 streets that you're on, when there's lots of families who are suffering because under the Thatcher government unemployment is 26%, then that is how the world is. That is how it is. And so Shuggie just keeps coming back with almost a purity to him, that sort of when his mother crumbles, he picks her up. When his brother does something terrible, he helps his brother. And I wanted almost for him to reflect the injustices of the world through that purity.
Thank you. There's another aspect of both books, which I think is certainly worth looking at, and that's the relationship between poverty and religious faith of one kind or another, which is a fairly major factor, however different they are, in both War of the Poor and Shuggie Bain. And maybe I could ask Eric about his view of the radical Protestantism that he depicts in Munzer and his associates. How far did they want a heaven in the hereafter? How far were they looking for a heaven on earth to be achieved through social revolution?
Quand on parle de cette relation entre la pauvreté et la foi religieuse, qui est un facteur majeur dans les 2 livres, quelle est votre vision de ce protestantisme radical? À quel point pensez-vous qu'il voulait non seulement un paradis, mais un paradis sur terre?
Alors, tout d'abord, je commencerai par une anecdote qui m'a frappé quand je travaillais sur Munzer, que je lisais des ouvrages sur lui. C'est que effectivement, il a été considéré par les luthériens ou par les catholiques comme un fanatique.
I would like to talk about an anecdote that I encountered whilst I was working on Thomas Munzer. The Lutherans and the Catholics considered him a fanatic.
Mais par ailleurs, lisant des correspondances d'ambassadeurs de Charles Quint, donc l'empereur catholique, je suis tombé sur des correspondances qui considèrent que Luther est un fanatique, donc qui parle du petit moine de Wittenberg aux yeux exorbités. Vous voyez.
And reading the correspondence of some ambassadors of Charles V, it was Luther who was considered a fanatic.
Voilà. Et ils allaient donc, comme je disais, jusqu'à parler de petits yeux exorbités, d'une espèce de folie de Luther. C'est-à-dire, c'était vraiment pour eux un fanatique, absolument.
He was described as having small eyes coming out of their sockets. He was considered a madman.
Donc, ce que je veux dire par là, c'est qu'on est toujours le fanatique d'un autre, d'une certaine manière.
In some ways, we're always somebody else's fanatic.
Pour en donner une autre illustration, puisque, disons, il y a 2 formes de fanatisme. On pourrait dire qu'il y a une sorte de fanatisme subjectif de certains, et puis il y a des sortes de fanatismes sociaux, le fanatisme même tranquille d'une société. Le féodalisme pourrait être vu d'ailleurs, par exemple, comme une forme de fanatisme, de vision sociale, en tout cas très radicale, très curieuse.
There are 2 types of fanaticism. There's obviously the one that is considered subjective, but there's also social fanaticism. And if we consider feudalism, for instance, it could be seen as a form of extremism, of fanaticism in its own right.
Ce que je veux dire, c'est que la colère de Munzer est peut-être en rapport avec la violence sourde, structurelle, une sorte de violence solide des institutions, à la fois religieuses et sociales.
Thomas Muntzer corresponds in a way to the structural violence of social and religious institutions of the time.
Je veux dire que sa colère est une réaction contre ça.
He merely reacts through his anger.
Pour donner un exemple de cette violence structurelle de la société, et même de manière générale, de la nôtre, je prendrai l'exemple d'un très beau livre qui reparaît aux États-Unis en ce moment, qui est un livre de Richard Wright, qui s'appelle The Man Who Lived Underground.
And to give an example of this structural violence, I'd like to talk about a book, The Man Who Lived Underground, from Richard Wright.
C'est un livre qui a été écrit en 1941 et qui commence par une scène de violence policière.
It was written in 1941 and starts with a scene of police violence.
Or, lors de sa publication aux États-Unis et dans le reste du monde, jusqu'à présent, il n'a jamais été publié en version intégrale. Ces violences policières ont été écartées.
And it was never published in its entire version. The police violence scene was actually removed.
Il a fallu en quelque sorte attendre 80 ans pour que la nouvelle soit publiée dans son intégrité.
It was only 80 years later that it was published as a whole, with that scene included.
Or, nous ne sommes plus une société féodale, vous voyez, donc c'est dans une société libérale aux États-Unis, en Angleterre, en France, là, on peut dire que la vitesse de la lumière, c'est 80 ans, c'est pas beaucoup. Hein.
In a society that we deem as liberal, the speed of light is 80 years.
Ce qui signifie donc que vous voyez, puisque 80 ans est la vitesse de la lumière dans une société libérale, on peut dire que l'ardeur de Thomas Muntzer doit être en rapport avec la résistance de son temps.
And his ardor has to be in correlation with his time and in the speed of his time.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Douglas again because religion in Shuggie Bain is always there simmering in the background because, of course, the people of Glasgow, however poor they are still divided. Catholicism and Protestantism runs like this river of fire separating poor communities. How do you feel about that sectarian dynamic, which was so important in the city that you were growing up? Why did it persist so long? What were people getting out of it?
I mean, that's a really naughty question. I think it's a difficult one to answer. You know, sectarianism in Glasgow affects just certain communities and certain classes. It's not something perhaps that goes across the city, but specifically to young men and to young working men who are looking to find their identity and their tribe, it can be a very powerful thing. It's interwoven in many ways with sports and the team that you support, but it does have a lot of different frequencies that can show up in the city. You'll know that Glasgow, or you might know that Glasgow has the second largest Orange March outside of Belfast. And that's because we have a lot of proud Irish immigration, but it brings a lot of clash between the Protestant culture and the Catholic culture. Now, for us, it's a little bit less of an identity question as it is for the Irish. You know, are you British? Are you Irish? And for us, it can often be just a way to show allegiance and the type of young man that you are. It's a thing that specifically affects young men, I would say. But I grew up with sectarianism, and having been someone who lived for 20 years in New York, there would be days where I would think to myself, was that really a thing? Did I really go through that? Especially when you're seeing a world try to divide itself along any kind of line, whether that's race or gender or are you a refugee or not? You know, where do you belong and what is yours and what is not yours? And to go back and think about sectarianism, where actually my father was Protestant and my mother was Catholic, and it still created an awful lot of tension at home. Actually, neither of them were very observant, which is the real irony of it. But yet they used it as a way to stereotype each other, to refer to each other with prejudiced terms. And growing up amongst it, I thought, we think it's banter is what we would call it in Glasgow. It was just a way of having patter and of saying these things. But today you would think of it as hate speech, even if it happened over the Sunday lunch table. And I was fascinated by that. And actually I continue to be fascinated by it. It's what my next novel is really all about. But I was fascinated by it because there is within working class communities an assumption that there's a solidarity and that we're all in it together. The middle class don't have to do that. It's all about individualism, but the working class were expected to all be together. And it's true, oftentimes that's what it's like, and we do rely on each other, but sometimes the solidarity can be used to divide us, and sometimes actually, in the case of Agnes and Shuggie, it's used to exclude them because they are not like the people around them. You know, they are socioeconomically and with all the opportunities they have, but they have these airs and graces and this oversized sense of pride, and they're projecting this thing that they're not really truly on the inside, and therefore the solidarity is united against them. And so I was thinking a lot about sectarianism, and I was thinking a lot about how people who are identical can really find the smallest fault line in order to pull themselves apart.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe that's a good moment to have our second reading. David, if you'd like to go back to Shuggie Bain.
The day was flat. That morning his mind had abandoned him and left his body wandering down below. The empty body went listlessly through its routine, pale and vacant-eyed under the fluorescent strip lights, as his soul floated above the aisles and thought only of tomorrow. Tomorrow was something to look forward to. Shuggie was methodical in setting up for his shift. All the pots of oily dips and spreads were decanted into clean trays, the edges wiped free of any splashes that would go brown quickly and ruin the illusion of freshness. The sliced hams were artfully arranged with fake parsley sprigs, and the olives were turned so that the viscous juice slid like mucus over their green skins. Anne McGee had the brass neck to call in sick again that morning, leaving him with the thankless task of running his deli counter and her rotisserie stand all alone. No day ever started well with 6 dozen raw chickens, and today, of all days, it was stealing the sweetness out of his daydreams. He pushed industrial skewers through each cold, dead bird and lined them up neatly in a row. They sat there with their stubby wings crossed over their fat little chests like so many headless babies. There was a time he would have taken pride in this orderliness. In reality, pushing the metal through the bumpy pink flesh was the easy part. The difficult part was resisting the urge to do the same to the customers. They would pore over the hot glass and study each of the carcasses in detail. They would choose only the best bird, ignorant to the fact that battery farming meant they were all identical. Shuggie would stand there, his back teeth pinching the inside of his cheek, and indulge their indecisiveness with a forced smile. Then the pantomime would really begin. "Guess 3 breasts, 5 thighs, and just 1 wing today, son." He prayed for strength. Why did no one want a whole chicken anymore? He would lift the carcass using long prongs, careful not to touch the birds with his gloved hands, and then he would dissect the parts neatly, skin intact, using catering scissors. He felt like a fool, standing there against the broiler lights. His scalp was sweating under the hairnet, and his hands were not quite strong enough to artfully snap the back of the chicken with the dull blades. He hunched slightly, the better to throw his back muscles behind the pressure in his wrists, and all the time he kept smiling. He had worked for Killfeathers for over a year. It was never meant to be that long. It was just that he had to feed himself and pay his own dig money each week, and the supermarket was the only business that would take him. Mr. Killfeather was a parsimonious bastard. He liked to staff the shop with anyone he didn't have to pay a full adult wage, and Shuggie found himself able to take short shifts that fit around his patchy schooling. In his dreams, he always intended to move on. He'd always loved to brush and play with hair. It was the only thing that made time truly fly. When he had turned 16, he had promised himself he would go to the hairdressing college that sat south of the River Clyde. He had gathered up all of his inspiration, the sketches he had copied from the Littlewoods catalogue and pages ripped from the Sunday magazines. Then he had gone to Cardonald's to see about the evening classes. At the bus stop outside the college, he alighted with a half-dozen 18-year-olds. They wore the newest, most fashionable gear and talked with a buzzing confidence that masked their own nerves. Shuggie walked half as fast as they did. He watched them go in the front door. Then he recrossed the street to catch the bus going the other way. He started at Killfeathers the following week. C'était une journée morne. Son esprit l'avait abandonné ce matin-là, laissant errer son corps vide. Il suivait sa routine, apathique, pâle, le regard éteint sous les néons fluorescents, tandis que son âme flottait au-dessus des rayons en ne pensant qu'au lendemain. Le lendemain, ça faisait quelque chose à espérer. Shuggie préparait méthodiquement son poste. Pot huileux de sauce froide et de pâte à tartiner, mis à décanter dans des bacs propres. Rebords essuyés pour éviter les éclaboussures qui bruniraient rapidement et briseraient l'illusion de fraîcheur. Tranches de jambon disposées harmonieusement et ornées de fausses branches de persil. Olives remuées pour que leur jus visqueux glisse comme du mucus sur leur peau verte. Anne-Maggie avait eu le culot de se faire à nouveau porter pâle ce matin-là, lui laissant la tâche ingrate de gérer seule sa rôtisserie en plus du stand d'épicerie fine. Aucune journée ne pouvait bien commencer avec 6 douzaines de poulets crus. Et ce jour-là, plus que tout autre, il dissipait la douceur de ses rêveries. Il enfonça une broche industrielle dans chacune des volailles froides qu'il aligna en une rangée régulière. Leurs ailes boudinées étaient repliées sur la petite poitrine dodue, comme autant de bébés décapités. Fut un temps, il aurait tiré une certaine fierté de cet arrangement. En réalité, faire pénétrer le métal dans la chair rose et granuleuse était la partie la plus facile. Le plus dur était de se retenir d'en faire autant avec les clients. Il se penchait sur la vitrine chauffée pour inspecter chaque carcasse. Il ne voulait que le meilleur, ignorant que l'élevage en batterie produisait des poulets identiques. Shuggie attendait, se pinçant les joues entre ses molaires et répondait à leur indécision avec un sourire forcé. C'était seulement à ce moment-là que le numéro commençait réellement. « Mets-y 3 escalopes, 5 cuisses et juste une aile aujourd'hui, mon petit gars. » Il priait Dieu de lui donner de la force. Pourquoi plus personne n'achetait du poulet entier ? Il soulevait la carcasse avec une grande pince, prenant soin de ne pas toucher la volaille avec ses mains gantées, puis il découpait soigneusement les morceaux, laissant la peau intacte, avec des ciseaux à viande. Il se sentait idiot, là, sous les lumières de la rôtisserie. Il transpirait sous le filet qui lui couvrait la tête et il n'avait pas la force dans ses mains pour faire céder les os du poulet avec les lames émoussées. Il se penchait légèrement pour solliciter les muscles de son dos sans cesser de sourire. Il travaillait pour Killfeathers depuis un peu plus d'1 an. Il n'avait jamais prévu de rester aussi longtemps. C'était simplement qu'il devait se nourrir et payer lui-même sa piole chaque semaine. Or, le supermarché était la seule entreprise qui avait bien voulu l'embaucher. Monsieur Killfeather était un sale radin qui aimait faire bosser tous ceux qui n'étaient pas obligés de payer autant que les adultes. Et Shuggie avait la possibilité de faire des horaires réduits qui s'accommodaient avec sa scolarité en pointillé. Dans ses rêves, il avait la ferme intention d'avancer. Il avait toujours aimé coiffer et jouer avec les cheveux. C'était la seule chose qui faisait réellement filer le temps. À ses 16 ans, il s'était promis qu'il irait à l'école de coiffure qui se trouvait au sud de la Clyde. Il avait réuni toutes ses inspirations, les croquis qu'il avait recopiés dans le catalogue Littlewoods et des pages arrachées au supplément des journaux du dimanche. Puis il était allé à Cardonald pour se renseigner sur les cours du soir. À l'arrêt de bus devant l'école, il était descendu en même temps qu'une demi-douzaine de garçons et de filles de 18 ans. Ils portaient les tenues les plus récentes et parlaient avec une confiance brillante destinée à masquer leur nervosité. Shuggie marchait 2 fois moins vite qu'eux. Il les regardait passer le portail, puis il traversa la rue pour reprendre le bus dans l'autre sens. Il débuta chez Killfeathers la semaine suivante.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. Now our time is rapidly drawing on, but I'd like to end by just asking both Eric and Douglas a question about audience. Revive the words, the voices of the poor. How far can the novelist hope to extend the reach of their own voice? In other words, to touch the people that you're writing about. Eric, how can fiction reach the successors of the people who revolted with Thomas Müntzer? Is that part of the job of the writer, to try and connect with a wider circle? Or is it simply their job to write fiction as well as they possibly can?
La question serait la question du public. Et pour faire revivre les voix des pauvres, jusqu'à quel point l'auteur doit-il étendre son influence sur le public? Eric, comment touchez-vous les successeurs de ces rebelles? Avez-vous l'intention de vous connecter avec un public plus large, ou en tant qu'écrivain, est-il une question d'écrire du mieux que vous pouvez?
Je crois que les notions de fiction, en fait, et de non-fiction sont à certains égards incertaines, défaillantes.
The mere ideas of fiction and non-fiction are flawed.
Je vais répondre d'une autre manière, puisque tout à l'heure, Boyd évoquait l'humour, le rôle de l'humour en littérature. Je tiens que l'humour est une forme, comment dire, très liée à l'histoire de la littérature, au fond, et qui produit une forme de connaissance.
I will answer in a different way. Boyd was talking about humor in literature earlier, and I think that humor is connected to literature in that it gives it strength.
On l'a très bien entendu dans le passage de Shuggie Bain, là, qui a été lu très bien, et j'en profite du coup pour remercier David Mildon pour sa lecture aussi de tout à l'heure. On a très bien entendu cet humour très corrosif, au fond, de Douglas.
We heard it in the extract, so artfully read by David. Thank you, David. We heard the corrosive power of that humor.
Or, d'une certaine façon, le présent raconté par Douglas est un présent qui est sans archives, justement. C'est même le propre, en quelque sorte, du présent, et notamment celui des classes populaires. Il n'y a pas de documents.
The present that Douglas narrates has no archive, there is no past to it, and that's the role of the present.
Et donc, d'une certaine façon, on peut dire que l'humour a pour rôle de nous dégriser de nos préjugés. C'est même au-delà de ça, il fait jaillir quelque chose qui est dans l'écriture elle-même, vous voyez, une forme de savoir.
Humor brings a form of knowledge, it takes away our prejudice.
On pourrait dire que la littérature, c'est un petit peu comme, vous allez, vous savez, parfois à la brocante acheter des couverts. Vous imaginez que ce sont des couverts d'argent. Et puis vous rentrez à la maison, vous mettez du vinaigre, vous frottez sur ces couverts. Et vous vous apercevez qu'ils sont en métal. Eh bien, la littérature, c'est le vinaigre.
Literature is a little bit like going to a bric-a-brac to buy silverware. You come home, you think it's silver, and then you pour vinegar on it, and you find out it was not. Well, literature is the vinegar.
Et alors, on pourrait dire que la forme de connaissance, l'une des formes de connaissance que la littérature produit, eh bien, Balzac lui a donné un titre, Les illusions perdues.
And that form of knowledge through literature was given a title by Balzac himself, Lost Illusions.
So much. Douglas, could I just finish by asking you basically the same question? Can you hope to reach the equivalence of Agnes and Shuggie? So, in other words, can a novel in the current circumstances of the publishing industry push its impact out into the world that your characters inhabit?
Yes, and I think actually that's been part of the success of Shuggie. I think the characters, you know, I've said many times, Boyd, that I didn't read a book until I was about 18. I grew up in a house without literature, and that wasn't especially unusual. I don't think people who grew up on either side of me turned to books either. It didn't make us any less compassionate or empathetic or creative. It just meant books were not how we experienced the world. And certainly within Shuggie Bain, Agnes and Shuggie don't neither find themselves represented in literature, nor do they turn to books. But the most wonderful compliment I've received, and I think one of the most gratifying things, is when people read the book and they say, whoa, I understand Agnes, I know an Agnes, I know Ginty, I know Eugene, and they feel that sense of truth come from the pages. And they also feel themselves represented in some way. They feel that suddenly they are in a book that is about them, and that is the greatest thing that I could ever have hoped for, actually. I don't know if you know, but the city of Glasgow painted a mural to Shuggie Bain that will last for about 20 years on the site of one of our most important landmarks. And to see my words reflected on one of the poorer corners of the city that inspired all the words is just mind-blowing for me. But I think the question also is a little, makes me a little sad, because I think this is a thing that is asked of working class voices that is never asked of middle class voices. Middle class voices are never expected to represent or to bring people to the page. It is always just assumed that it is already about them. And so we ask working class voices to meet lots of different conditions and then also to sort of expand it. And that's because underlying there is a problem in literature. There is a problem of representation in publishing. And so I'm so glad that Shuggie can do a little bit of that, but it's not a thing that just one book can do. This is a thing where especially the British publishing industry has to keep looking outside of its usual channels to find writers and their voices, because they are not reflecting a diverse nation.
Thank you so much, Douglas Stewart. Thank you, Eric Weir. Thank you, Axel Oxborough, for translating so well. Thank you, David Mildon, for reading brilliantly in 2 languages from both books. If you haven't read War of the Poor and Shuggie Bain, you know now that you must. It's been great to have all of you with us this evening. And the Beyond Word Festival continues. It continues tomorrow, Saturday at 4 p.m. With an event on biographics, on how the graphic novel can represent the lives of actual characters. So that sounds absolutely fascinating. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our helpers. And thank you for joining us. Good night.